You won't believe what happened to me the night I sat at my boyfriend's family dinner table. Because honestly, I can hardly believe it myself. Sometimes life has a way of throwing you into situations that feel like they belong in a movie, not in real life, and this was exactly one of those nights. Imagine walking into a house where you already feel like an outsider, trying to put on your best smile, trying to make the best impression possible. Because the man you love has told you over and over again how much his parents' approval means to him, and how important it is for his father especially to respect the woman he chooses to be with. I had spent the whole day preparing for that dinner, carefully choosing my dress, fixing my hair, practicing polite small talk in my head, even rehearsing my answers to potential awkward questions about my family, my career, or my past, because I knew his parents came from a different world than me, a world of old money, private schools, golf memberships, and carefully curated reputations. But what I didn't know was that no matter how much I prepared, no matter how hard I tried to show grace and kindness, nothing would shield me from the cruel words that were about to be thrown in my face, words so harsh that they still echo in my mind to this day. Street garbage. When I heard those words, time almost froze. My fork was halfway to my mouth. My boyfriend's mother had just asked me politely about my work, and suddenly his father leaned back in his chair, smirked, and spat out that phrase with the kind of venom that only comes from someone who believes they are untouchable. I felt my heart drop into my stomach, my cheeks burn, my throat tighten, and in that split second, the entire room went silent, as though every person sitting there was shocked, but too scared to speak. It was one of those moments when you wish the floor would open up and swallow you, when you can feel your whole world shifting, and yet somehow you have to keep breathing, keep sitting, keep pretending that you haven't just been shredded by words sharp enough to cut through bone. What's worse is that this wasn't just a passing insult, it was a deliberate attempt to humiliate me in front of everyone, to make me feel small, worthless, undeserving of love, and most of all, unworthy of his son. And let me tell you, the pain of that moment wasn't just in the insult itself, but in the realization that the man I loved, the man sitting right next to me, suddenly had to make a choice: defend me and risk clashing with his father, or stay silent and leave me to drown in humiliation. In that instant, I could feel all eyes on me, waiting to see how I would react. Would I cry? Would I argue back? Would I excuse myself from the table? My boyfriend's father had thrown a grenade into the middle of dinner, and I was the one left, holding the pieces. But what none of them expected, what even I didn't fully realize yet, was that I wasn't going to stay silent. I wasn't going to stay broken, and I certainly wasn't going to let a man who thought he could control everyone's lives with money and power get away with calling me street garbage. No, I was going to show him exactly who he had underestimated. And the way I did it changed everything, not just for me and my boyfriend, but for his entire family. Because later that night, after swallowing my pride and enduring the rest of that excruciating dinner, I made a decision so bold, so shocking, that it left his father speechless and completely powerless. And when you hear what I did, you'll understand why I say that sometimes. The best revenge doesn't come from shouting back, but from calmly dismantling the pedestal of the person who tries to tear you down. The silence that followed his words was unbearable, stretching across the dinner table like a suffocating blanket, and for a moment I couldn't even hear the clinking of forks or the low hum of conversation. Everything seemed to pause, as though the universe itself wanted me to absorb the weight of what had just been said. My eyes darted to my boyfriend, desperately searching for some kind of rescue, some sign that he would stand up for me, but all I saw was hesitation in his face, as though he was torn between the woman he claimed to love and the father he had spent his entire life trying to please. His hand twitched slightly as if he wanted to reach for mine, but he stopped short, and that hesitation cut me even deeper than the insult itself. Meanwhile, his mother, trying desperately to save face, shifted uncomfortably in her chair and muttered something about the roast needing salt, pretending she hadn't just witnessed her husband humiliate me in front of everyone. The other relatives, his cousins, his uncle, even his teenage niece, kept their eyes glued to their plates, the cowardice in their silence screaming louder than any words ever could. I sat there frozen, my appetite gone, the carefully plated food in front of me turning to ash in my mouth, but I refused to let tears fall. No, I wouldn't give his father that satisfaction. Instead, I forced myself to swallow down the lump in my throat, sit up straighter, and plaster on the faintest smile I could muster. as though his insult had bounced right off me. Inside, however, I was crumbling, replaying his words over and over in my head. Street garbage. Where had that even come from? Was it my background? The fact that I hadn't grown up in wealth like them? Was it because I didn't wear designer labels or flaunt a last name that carried influence? Or maybe it was because of the rumors I knew had circled about my upbringing, whispers that my family had struggled financially, that I'd worked jobs that people like him looked down on, that I had clawed my way through life without the safety net of generational wealth. In his eyes, all of that probably reduced me to trash, someone his son should never have brought home, let alone loved. I remember trying to take another sip of water, my hands trembling slightly, and when I caught his father smirking across the table as though he had already won, as though he had successfully put me in my place, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder, steadier, a quiet storm building deep within me, telling me that this moment would not define me, that his attempt to break me was going to backfire in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. So, I endured. I let the dinner drag on with its fake politeness and forced laughter, pretending to ignore the dagger still lodged in my chest. But while they all thought I was shrinking, what I was really doing was calculating every detail of that dinner: the smug look on his face, the awkward silence of the guests, the timid glances from my boyfriend etched itself into my memory, fueling the decision I was about to make. Because the truth is, I wasn't just some powerless girl who could be insulted and discarded. I had my own power, my own network, and most importantly, I had information. And what his father didn't realize, sitting there so smug in his chair, was that I knew things about him that he never thought would come to light, things that could dismantle the perfect image he had worked so hard to project. At that dinner, I decided I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to storm out. I wasn't going to break. No, I was going to wait. I was going to smile, finish my meal, thank them politely, and walk out of that house with my head held high. But once I was gone, once I had the privacy to act, I was going to make a move so calculated, so devastating, that when it unfolded, my boyfriend's father would finally understand what it meant to underestimate me. And that, right there, at that very dinner table, was the birth of the plan that would change everything. When I finally left their house that night, I remember the cool night air hitting my face like a slap, almost as if the universe was reminding me that I was still alive, still breathing, and still in control of my own story, despite the humiliation I had just endured. My boyfriend had walked me to the car in silence, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes glued to the ground, and I could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. He wanted to apologize. I could see it in the way his lips parted slightly, but the apology never came. Instead, he muttered something about how his dad could be a little harsh sometimes, as though calling me street garbage was the equivalent of a bad joke or a slip of the tongue. That was the moment I realized that if I was waiting for him to defend me, I would be waiting forever. He was too conditioned to obey his father, too afraid of losing his approval to stand up for me in any meaningful way. So, as I slid into the driver's seat of my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, I made a silent vow to myself. I didn't need him to fight for me, because I was going to fight for myself, but this fight wasn't going to be loud or messy. No, it was going to be precise, deliberate, and merciless. I went home that night and sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the city lights flickering outside my window, and I began to think back on every interaction I had ever had with his father. He was arrogant, yes, but arrogance has a way of leaving cracks, of exposing weaknesses when you least expect it. I remembered stories I had overheard, careless comments he had made, whispers from others in his social circle who weren't as loyal as they pretended to be. And then it hit me. I had something on him, something big. Months before, at a charity gala, I had accidentally stumbled upon a conversation he was having with a business associate. He hadn't noticed me standing nearby, but I had heard enough discussions of questionable deals, money being moved through places it shouldn't have been, and the kind of arrogance that comes from believing no one will ever dare to hold you accountable. At the time, I had tucked it away in the back of my mind, not sure if it was important, but now, sitting in my apartment with my heart still aching from the sting of his words, I realized that this was my weapon. This was the leverage I had never planned to use but now couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, while pretending to go about my normal life, I quietly began to gather every thread I could pull on. I reached out to acquaintances, checked old notes I had written down, and pieced together a picture of his dealings that would have been enough to raise eyebrows if it ever saw the light of day. And the more I dug, the clearer it became. Behind his polished reputation, his expensive suits, and his smug superiority, he was hiding secrets that could ruin him. That realization didn't just give me strength, it gave me focus. Because suddenly, I wasn't just the girl he had insulted at dinner. I was the girl who held his future in her hands. And the irony of it all was delicious. He had called me street garbage, yet it was the so-called garbage who was about to drag his empire through the mud. Every night after work, I sat at my desk with papers spread out in front of me, my laptop glowing, my phone buzzing with quiet updates from people willing to talk when asked the right way. I became consumed by the plan, not out of bitterness alone, but out of a need to reclaim the dignity he had tried to strip from me. Each piece of evidence I found was like a brick, and slowly, methodically, I was building a wall that would eventually close in on him. My boyfriend, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He called, he texted, he asked when we could see each other, but my answers grew shorter, colder. I no longer saw him as the man who could protect me. I saw him as part of the problem, too weak to stand up for me, too blind to see the monster his father truly was. And the more distance I created between us, the more clarity I gained about what I had to do next. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. About making sure that a man who thrived on tearing others down would finally face consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. And deep down, I knew the opportunity was coming, the chance to expose him in a way that would leave him gasping for control. The way he had left me gasping for dignity at that dinner table. I just had to be patient, careful, and ruthless enough to follow it through. The first real step of my plan came unexpectedly, almost as if fate itself had opened a door for me to walk through. A week after that disastrous dinner, I was invited to another event, a fundraiser for a local hospital, and, though my heart still carried the sting of humiliation, I knew I had to go. Not because I wanted to be in the same room as his father again, but because I had learned that powerful men always reveal more when they think they're untouchable, and gatherings like this were his natural hunting ground. I slipped into the event with quiet confidence, choosing a simple but elegant dress that spoke more about poise than money. And I made sure to carry myself as though nothing in the world could shake me. If he saw me, he would expect me to shrink, to avoid him, but instead I mingled with people, smiled, introduced myself, and let my presence quietly contradict his cruel label of street garbage. And sure enough, he noticed. I caught his eyes narrowing across the room, a flicker of irritation passing over his face, as though my very existence at an event filled with polished elites challenged his authority. But instead of confronting me directly, he did what arrogant men often do. He assumed I was too small to matter, too insignificant to play in his world. That mistake was his downfall, because while he was laughing loudly with his associates, boasting about his latest projects, I was quietly listening, watching, and waiting. And then it happened. He let his guard down. Standing near the bar, drink in hand, he began talking about an upcoming business move, something that sounded harmless on the surface, but which, with the right context, could expose the shady dealings I already suspected. I casually struck up a conversation with one of his acquaintances later that night, and with a little charm and subtle questions, I managed to confirm exactly what I needed. He was involved in contracts that weren't entirely legal, and worse, he had enemies who would relish the chance to see him fall. That night, when I returned home, my hands were trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline. The puzzle pieces were coming together, and I was no longer just reacting to his insult. I was orchestrating something bigger. I spent hours cross-referencing names, companies, and documents, connecting the dots that most people wouldn't bother to see. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became, because I knew I was meddling in a world where money and power silenced those who spoke out. But I wasn't afraid, not anymore. His words had already stripped me bare, and once someone has torn you down that far, there's a strange kind of freedom in realizing you have nothing left to lose. So, I leaned in deeper. I began documenting everything, saving emails, recording conversations when I could, compiling evidence that painted a picture of a man who wasn't just cruel in his personal life, but corrupt in his professional one. And as I worked late into the night, my apartment lit only by the glow of my laptop screen, I thought back to that dinner table, to the smug way he had looked at me when he spat out street garbage, and I whispered to myself that soon, very soon, the world would see who the real garbage was. My boyfriend remained blissfully unaware of what I was doing. To him, I was just busy, distracted, perhaps even pulling away. He asked me once, during a phone call, if I was still upset about his dad's comment, and I remember laughing softly, telling him I had moved past it. But in truth, I hadn't moved past it at all. I had weaponized it. His father had handed me the motivation I needed, and I was going to use it to destroy the very foundation of his empire. And the beauty of it was that I didn't need to scream, or fight, or demand an apology. All I had to do was let the truth come to light. And once it did, his carefully curated image, the one he had built brick by brick over decades, would come crashing down in front of everyone. And the best part, I wouldn't even need to lift a finger when it happened. I would simply sit back, watch the dominoes fall, and know that justice had finally caught up to him. The first cracks in his armor didn't appear with an explosion but with a whisper. The kind of subtle unraveling that only someone watching closely would notice. It started with small things: an associate backing out of a deal, a phone call he took in hushed tones that left him red-faced and irritable, a sudden stiffness in the way people greeted him at public events. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like business as usual, the normal ebb and flow of a man constantly juggling power and responsibility. But to me, it was confirmation that my careful digging was starting to take effect. I had fed just enough information into the right channels, whispered a detail here, sent an anonymous tip there, ensuring that the people who already distrusted him began to question him even more. And once suspicion takes root, it grows like a weed. I remember sitting in a cafe one afternoon, my laptop open in front of me, reading an online forum where investors speculated about sudden inconsistencies in his company's filings, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. This wasn't a random coincidence, it was the beginning of the storm I had set in motion. Still, I knew better than to get careless. I kept my movements quiet, never leaving a trail that could lead back to me, because if he ever discovered that I was the one pulling the strings, the retaliation would be brutal. But in a strange way, that risk only fueled me more, made me sharper, more precise. Meanwhile, my relationship with my boyfriend was deteriorating by the day. He could sense that I was slipping away, that my laughter no longer rang as freely when we spoke, that my affection had turned guarded, but he didn't know why. He tried to patch things up with sweet gestures, dinners, little surprises. But how could I accept flowers from a man who sat silently while his father humiliated me? Every time I looked at him, I saw not just the man I had once loved, but also the shadow of his father looming behind him. And I realized that my revenge wasn't just about the insult, it was about reclaiming myself from a toxic world that had tried to swallow me whole. One night, as I scrolled through documents I had collected, cross-referencing them with news articles and public records, I found the final piece of the puzzle. It was evidence of a financial trail leading directly to him, proof that money had been funneled through shell accounts tied to questionable overseas operations. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. I remember staring at the screen, my pulse racing, because I knew this was it. This was the nail in the coffin. I could have sent it to the authorities right then, could have burned him down in a matter of days, but something inside me told me to wait. Timing was everything. If I moved too quickly, he could bury the evidence, call in favors, silence those around him. But if I waited for the perfect moment, when he was already vulnerable, already under suspicion, the blow would land so hard he wouldn't be able to recover. And so I waited, watching from the sidelines as his world grew shaken. By the week, his associates stopped trusting him, his wife grew colder at public appearances, and even my boyfriend confessed one evening that his father seemed off, more paranoid than usual, lashing out at everyone around him. I said nothing, just nodded sympathetically, while inside me, a quiet fire burned brighter. The man who had once smirked across the dinner table, so certain of his superiority, was beginning to feel the ground shift beneath him, and he didn't even know that it was me, the woman he had dismissed as street garbage, who was turning the soil. Every night, I fell asleep with the same thought echoing in my mind. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, and he was about to fall harder than anyone could imagine. The night everything finally began to unravel felt almost ordinary at first, the kind of evening where no one suspects the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. He was scheduled to give a speech at a prestigious business forum, a stage where powerful men like him flaunted their success and reaffirmed their dominance in front of cameras and investors. My boyfriend had asked if I wanted to attend, perhaps as some unspoken attempt at reconciliation, but I politely declined, claiming I had other commitments. The truth was, I had been waiting for this night, preparing for it, because I knew that what was about to unfold would change everything. As I sat in my apartment, the television on and the live stream playing across the screen, I watched him stride confidently onto the stage, wearing that same smug smile I had seen the night he called me street garbage. His voice carried across the hall, commanding, practiced, dripping with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He spoke about integrity, about leadership, about building legacies, and I almost laughed at the hypocrisy of it, because while he stood there basking in applause, my carefully prepared package of evidence was already making its way to the inboxes of the very journalists covering the event. I had timed it perfectly, emails sent anonymously, documents attached, trails highlighted so clearly that even the most skeptical eye couldn't ignore them. Within minutes, the whispers started. I could see it on the screen, the shifting in seats, the sudden glances down at phones, the murmurs rippling through the crowd as people began to read what had landed in their hands. At first, he didn't notice. He kept talking, his voice booming, about vision and honor, until he caught sight of the restless energy moving through the room. His speech faltered for the briefest second, a crack in the facade, before he pressed on, louder, almost desperate, as though volume could drown out the truth. But the truth was already out, spreading like wildfire. Reporters began exchanging looks, typing furiously, cameras zooming closer, as if they could capture the exact moment his empire began to crumble. And then it happened. One bold journalist stood up and asked him, on live broadcast, about the offshore accounts tied to his name, about the fraudulent contracts, about the deals that now lay exposed in black and white. The color drained from his face, the smug smile replaced by a flicker of panic, and for the first time, I saw him exactly as he was, not a powerful man, but a cornered one. He stammered, tried to laugh it off, denied, deflected, but the room was no longer his to control. Every question cut deeper, every flash of a camera sealed his humiliation further. His wife, sitting in the front row, looked mortified, her eyes darting around as though searching for an escape. My boyfriend, who I later learned had been there, sat frozen, torn between loyalty and disbelief, his world cracking open in front of him. And me. I sat at home.com, sipping my tea, watching it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction, not because I wanted to destroy him for sport, but because I wanted him to feel what I had felt, that sharp, undeniable sting of being stripped of dignity in front of an audience. Except, in his case, it wasn't just words, it was exposure, reputation, and power slipping through his fingers. By the time he left that stage, flanked by nervous aides and shouting journalists, his carefully crafted image was in shambles. The headlines were already blazing across news sites, the story spreading faster than he could contain it, and for once in his life, money and connections weren't enough to silence the truth. He had underestimated me, dismissed me, called me garbage, and yet here I was, the invisible hand pulling the rug out from under him. And as the cameras captured his fall from grace, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning of his reckoning. Because once the world starts questioning a man like him, once the cracks are visible, the collapse becomes inevitable. And I was going to make sure the collapse went all the way down to the very foundations of everything he had built. In the days that followed his public humiliation, the ripple effect was relentless, like a tidal wave swallowing every trace of the empire he had spent decades constructing. News outlets dug deeper, uncovering more layers of corruption and shady dealings than even I had anticipated. Associates who once boasted about their loyalty suddenly distanced themselves, deleting pictures, erasing connections, pretending they had never been part of his inner circle. Investors pulled out overnight, contracts collapsed, and his name, once synonymous with wealth and respect, became a stain whispered in hushed tones. I remember scrolling through article after article, each headline harsher than the last, and instead of feeling guilty, I felt a strange, liberating clarity. This wasn't revenge anymore, it was correction. The universe finally balancing itself after years of him crushing others beneath his arrogance. And while the world was busy dissecting his fall, my personal world shifted to my boyfriend called me, panicked, his voice trembling as he tried to explain how everything had gone wrong, how his father was being unfairly targeted. He didn't know the truth, of course, didn't realize that I was the architect of the storm, but, as he spoke, I realized just how far apart we had grown. The man who had once been my everything now sounded like a stranger clinging to a sinking ship, blind to the fact that the ship had been rotten all along. When he asked if I would stand by him, if I would help his family through the crisis, I paused for a long moment before answering with the calmest words I had ever spoken. I stood by you when your father called me garbage, and you said nothing. Now, I stand by myself. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know, and when I hung up, I felt no sadness, only release. The family that had tried to break me no longer held any power over me. Meanwhile, his father was crumbling. Reporters camped outside his home, his business partners filed lawsuits, and the people who once laughed at his jokes now mocked his downfall. Even within his household, the walls closed in. His wife, unable to endure the shame, retreated into silence, while his children scattered, desperate to salvage their own reputations, and the man himself, he became a ghost of who he once was: angry, paranoid, isolated, pacing in a mansion that suddenly felt more like a prison than a palace. I heard through whispers that he raged about betrayal, convinced someone close to him had orchestrated it all, but he never suspected me. To him, I had been insignificant, disposable, forgettable, and that blindness had been his undoing. The irony was too poetic. The girl he had tried to humiliate at his dinner table was the very one who counseled him, stripped him of the respect he had guarded so fiercely. But my victory wasn't about standing over his ruins with a triumphant laugh. It was about walking away, free, knowing that his words no longer had the power to define me. For the first time in a long time, I looked in the mirror and didn't see the girl who had been insulted. I saw a woman who had taken control of her own story, who had turned pain into power. And while the world continued to gossip about his downfall, I simply moved forward, building a life untouched by his shadow. Some might say I should have forgiven, that revenge only breeds emptiness, but I disagree. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming the dignity he tried to steal, about reminding him, and everyone like him, that no matter how high you build yourself up, you cannot crush others without consequence. And so, when people ask me how I managed to stay strong after being called street garbage, I smile and say the truth. I didn't just stay strong, I became the storm. And in the end, the man who thought he could destroy me was the one destroyed, not by violence, not by rage, but by the simple truth he never thought would catch up to him. And that truth is what counseled him for good.